Jai Hind, Jai Bharat, and welcome to Dev Talks. This is Aadi. I have with me someone for the first time on Dev Talks, a renowned economist, an author, and a commentator, Mr. Saurav Jha, who's going to tell us how is the new global world order going to open out with the current economic situation that we are seeing in front of us. Firstly, Mr. Saurav, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to Dev Talks.
Thank you, Aadi, for having me over. I'm glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much, sir. Let's talk about the economy first. You know, the world economy kind of seems very erratic, if I may use that word. Except for one or two bright spots in the world, generally speaking, it's quite a bad situation, and that is bringing about a change in geopolitical thought, in geopolitical standing, in geopolitical uh, future of the world. I want to base this particular question on the Western economy. Where have they gone wrong, and why is it that they've not been able to realize what they're doing wrong?
Well, Adi, geopolitics and geoeconomics, right? These two things are totally intertwined with each other. You cannot really study large affairs in a vacuum. In fact, that has been my perspective from the very early days. So, as far as the Western economies are concerned, well, look, their prosperity was initially driven by the Industrial Revolution and colonization, right? Which went hand in hand because they needed new markets and they needed the resources to feed new production. So they attained scale in the manufacturing sector. It's all about attaining scale. Subsequently, they what happens is because of course this is my viewpoint, because of the what we call the nexus between energy, food, and water, it becomes increasingly difficult to run a truly diversified economy, because where you see, because land with groundwater is a finite resource, not land in general nor groundwater. These are not finite. I mean, land is a finite resource if you see it in a very long, on a very long term basis, but land with groundwater can be a finite resource even on a medium term basis. And the reason for that is simple, because you would have noticed 90% of all civilization is located within 10 kilometers of some major water source, right? So it's essentially river basins that you're talking about. So river basins in the West, as they went through industrialization, transition from agriculture to industry to services, and increasingly what they did was, because the notion was that we need to now leave all the dirty manufacturing sectors, we need to move up the value chain. They ended up financializing themselves, because it is never easy for a monetary production economy to really run a diversified setup. Now this will be a long discussion in its own right, so I'll just keep it short there. So what happened was, the United States in particular, because of the military competition, here the geopolitical aspects also come in, because of their military competition with the Soviet Union during the late stage of the Cold War, they came up with a scheme where they would, start outsourcing consumer industries elsewhere, and would focus more mainly on the strategic industries and on higher value industries and stuff like that. Because had they tried to do both, right, inflation would have reared its head much earlier in their economies, because they already had felt one inflationary shock in the 70s. Not one, those were actually two or three discrete shocks. Some of them were driven from the resource side, the oil shock of
Yeah.
1973, but there were other factors as well. So they, and then then in the 1980s, you had the Volcker shock, which was given by the Federal Reserve, the Central Bank of America, where interest rates were suddenly taken into double digits, and a recession was created because inflation was going out of hand, and people were refusing to, even Italian bartenders in Italy were refusing to accept dollar payments because of high inflation in America. So that Volcker shock created an instant recession, but it tamed inflation, right? So that there's always a trade-off between inflation and growth, as you know. It's never
Yeah.
so quite so simple. So from the monetary policy perspective, they basically tamed inflation, which is the main remit of any central bank, any inflation targeting central bank. But it came at the cost of growth, and it and at the cost of recession, and at the cost at the cost of future growth. Because every recession, as new research shows, tends to, not new, well, recent research shows, tends to lower the rate of potential output. Okay, the potential growth rate in the future lower. There are permanent losses associated with every recession. This is in contrary, this is contrary to standard business cycle theory, where you simply return to the old equilibrium after a recession. It doesn't work that way. You actually go to a lower equilibrium path as far as your growth path is concerned. So the Western growth path has been getting lowered from time to time, right? After the so-called golden age of capitalism, which happened after the Second World War, when all those surplus military industries were turned into, for into consumer industries, all the productivity that was unleashed, because that basically came out of many developments of World War II, was turned towards the broader economy, and that gave the golden age of capitalism. But after that, you will see a series of shocks have happened in the Western economy. And the more financialized the Western economies have become, see, it's very simple. Things like GE and all, by the 2000s, had started deriving 50% of their profit from their financial businesses. Insurance, GE Insurance. Auto insurance was becoming as big as auto sales, if
Yeah.
not bigger. So that sort of thing was deriving them. It's very natural. What happens is when you so-called develop a riverine basin, it becomes more and more difficult to extract profit out of old style activities over there. This has been observed everywhere, even because productivity does plateau after a while, and the market shrinks unless you can find large export markets elsewhere. But that was not the
Hmm.
model taken. The model taken is, you will find that even in India it's happening. Industrial warehouses turn into apartment complexes, or into a multi development retail sort of a, kind of a retail. You have a basically all tertiary sector. It turns into a tertiary sector site, right? It'll turn into a mall. It'll turn into a sort of office complex. It'll have some apartment complex with it. And this has happened. You will see it even in Delhi, say in Narayana, or in Calcutta. Calcutta is an even better example, because that was the first industrial city. I have seen in front of my own eyes growing up how many, industrial enterprises have shuttered, and some tertiary sector activity has taken its place.
Hmm.
Right? So this has happened across the West, and deindustrialization is a reality. But the problem is that when you lose manufacturing employment, because see, in terms of value, the United States is still a top manufacturer in the world in terms of sheer value. But in terms of manufacturing employment, it has lost a lot of that. Manufacturing employment has declined considerably all across the West. Now, when you lose that, those jobs, those sort of high value jobs of manufacturing, it becomes more and more difficult to sustain aggregate demand in the economy. That
Hmm.
services sector does not prove to be a nirvana. Okay, that services sector, whatever fire jobs it generates, financial, finance, insurance, real estate, and other allied sectors, they can't compensate. And so you have a bedrock of people who suddenly find that they are receding from the middle class. And people have left agriculture anyway in these societies. So the only thing that happens in such monetary production economies, unfortunately, is more financialization and the attendant instability in the economy. And the instability, the macroeconomic instability, leads to increasing, the potential for recessions. And every
Hmm.
recession leads to a decline in the potential growth rate of the economy. And this has happened to the United States. Right. It happened, like I said, it happened in the 70s. Then there was a self-induced recession called the Volcker shock by the Central Bank of the United States. Then in 1980, 1990, the United States almost faced a new recession. Right. A book was written at that time, The Coming Recession of 1990, by an economist called Ravi Batra, who was of Indian origin, but he went to America. It's quite famous at the time. Then, of course, you had the dot-com bubble burst, right? And then you supposedly had the period of great moderation when inflation was kept in check, but the financial economy was allowed to run riot, right? Leading to ultimately the global financial crisis of 2008. So
Yeah.
all of these recessionary shocks have lowered the potential output of the United States, which cannot actually grow at anywhere near 2% anymore, right? And that is what you're seeing in the last quarter. GDP growth rate is only 1.1%. So potential output, that is the growth rate of potential output, has been consistently being lowered in the West, and this is even more true for Europe, which is facing demographic decline as well. So what is happening is you have a whole bunch of countries that are facing recessionary headwinds all the time because their potential output is not great. Aggregate demand is failing, and they are basically being able to keep it together because of their incumbent position in the global financial economy, right? Which is why they can unleash torrents of liquidity. They can unleash torrents of liquidity from time to time to essentially support their economy from collapsing altogether. Why do you think they came up with such a big monetary and fiscal response to the corona shock? The reason was simple. Had they accepted a major recession, then that potential output would have gone down, to almost close to zero, which is where probably it is for the Eurozone in general. And as we have seen, Japan has been in a stagnation since the Heisei bubble failed, right, from 1990. So that is the state of affairs in the advanced economies in the world. They are increasingly deindustrialized. They are old. They are financialized, and they basically keep their highly leveraged macroeconomies afloat using their financial incumbency. Okay, consider, very loosely, consider a zamindari, which built up a lot of things in its heyday and is now basically leveraging all the assets it has built to use lines of credit. I mean, this is a very, very, sort of a very simplistic way I'm saying this. They also have technology, of course. The other reason, when you talk about the US dollar and hegemony, you're talking about the techno dollar essentially. The
Yeah.
other thing, the other great virasat or asset that they have is the intellectual property. And that is true for all of the advanced economies. So that is where they are. So they don't have any real answers as to what to do. One answer for them would be trade, okay, which is the usual, answer to people who are children of Schumpeter and Ricardo. You know, Alois Schumpeter and David Ricardo. David Ricardo gave the world the theory of comparative advantage, right, which is still the bedrock for justifying trade. Although there are many forms, but at its most basic forms, it explains why trade can happen between two countries, even if one country has an absolute advantage in terms of cost in producing both items, right? So a lot of things have been built on that. Although in my view, it explains trade less and explains why trade may be a possibility. Right, it doesn't explain the current order of global trade. That is far more complex. And of course, Schumpeter, who talked about monetary production economies, and in any way he talked about technological waves, how technological waves enhance productivity and keep an economy afloat in terms of its growth potential. That has happened in the West. Those technological waves also happened. The IT revolution was a major technological wave.
Yeah.
Without that, they would have been even deeper in the quicksand. Right, but they are in some sort of quicksand. So the only way out for them now what has happened is, because of this whole corona crisis, they have managed to ignite inflation in their economies also, because the huge fiscal and monetary stimulus given has met a huge disruption in global supply chains. See, one of the main reasons why they managed to keep inflation low was by outsourcing and offshoring, right? That was, like I said, here I circle back to that old issue of the 1980s when they were locked in competition with the Soviet Union. Inflation would have just gone through the roof had they tried to keep production of both consumer items and strategic items on their own soil. So that compact that they had with China, that gave them the deflationary pressure they needed to run these financialized economies. But now that deflationary pressure is receding because costs in China are increasing, and also there was a general disruption that has happened, and that has been compounded by the Russia-Ukraine war. So they are now in a bit of a fix. They have a huge monetary overhang, which is fine as long as there is a deflationary tendency in the economy. All that money will simply sit as reserves in commercial banks. okay, who will be paid interest on those reserves. And because there will be no great demand in the economy, they will not feel compelled to increase loan making. So that was the
Hmm.
sweet spot. You see, they had a sweet spot right there. Low inflation, low growth. That is what was still working for them, especially after the GFC. But now they are in a situation where low growth is very much there, but they have high inflation,
Yeah.
right? Because of the way the COVID crisis unfolded. So they are now in a bit of a fix. They now need a new global deflationary force. And that is where India comes in. India has to become the new China. Otherwise, inflation will become entrenched in these economies and their monetary overhang will become absolutely impossible to manage. You see, you get the picture what the West has done. The West has constantly and very cleverly outsourced certain things at various stages of their development to reach the so-called advanced economy stage of
Hmm.
$60,000 per capita income GDP nominal per year that they have today, the United States. But all that glisters is not gold. They have been hollowing out their economies for a long time. Of course,
Yeah.
this is cold comfort because this is the only model of development that the whole world has. So,
Hmm.
and why do you think China tried to do the same thing? Because China also found out that they were over invested in various sectors and the return for capital was declining. So they also, this all this talk of dual circulation, this is nothing new. They have been trying to rebalance their economy since
Hmm.
2004,
Hmm.
right? Because the funny part is as far as when you look at China's GDP, consumption is still less than 40% of GDP.
Yeah.
Right. For us, it is say almost 60%. That has been
Hmm.
varying. It has been varying between 58. So we are a consumption-driven economy, but they are not. They are still an investment and export-driven economy. And then an investment and export was completely coupled with the West's need to offshore and import. Get the picture?
Hmm.
Now that global decoupling is happening between China and the West because of the geopolitical reasons that you outlined, because see, ultimately, a lot of the West told the people that it's about prosperity, but it's not just about prosperity, it is about power. When the Japanese when Japanese enterprise and the Japanese economy in general came into a position to challenge the United States, we all know what they did to Japan in the
Yeah.
1980s.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
got them to sign the Plaza Accord. The amount of hatred and bile that was poured against the Japanese was unimaginable in the 80s. They were seeing a yellow peril everywhere. There are always racist overtones that come in every time into a scenario like this. So that was one lesson the Chinese took. So you will find the Chinese writing from 2009 and 10 started saying that it doesn't seem as if the United States will agree to China's peaceful rise. So it became, of course, that was also a self-serving argument because China was never really looking for a peaceful
Peaceful.
rise
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah.
Right? So, and the West was foolish to think that that prosperity will lead to liberalization within China. Political
That's
liberalization.
yeah.
That
That's the
was
whole
again
thing. Hmm.
that was another self-serving argument. So this is where the global economy is poised. The West is in no position to drive global growth, is in fact looking for new pillars to support its own position. Because it doesn't want, the West has been seriously looking to avoid the Great Depression. Their entire policies have been designed to avoid the Great Depression again. Right, as I also outlined in my book in Negotiating the New Normal, I outlined the first few chapters about that. They do not want a new great recession that leads to a 25% contraction in their GDP. That would
Hmm.
destroy their global position altogether. Because you see, this is not 1929. This is not a day when China is being riven by warlords. Russia is in the middle of has just is in its own kind of crisis as the Soviet Union is emerging from the Soviet Civil War, and India is subjugated by the British.
Yeah.
A Great
Times have
Depression,
changed.
a Great Depression would absolutely destroy the West's position in the world order. Right. So they will try to avoid that. And I just outlined some of the means in which they will do that. But they need India. Now the question is, this is the moment of opportunity for India. Because India needs manufacturing. Otherwise, we'll be stuck in the middle income trap. If we don't have that high value creating, value multiplying sector in the middle, and just have agriculture and services, whether high end and low end, then we'll just have people who will migrate from the towns and villages, and we'll look to observe, absorb them as security guards and basically have a neo-feudal setup, in the cities, which we already have to an extent. So we need that manufacturing push and that window of opportunities here. So that is what I would say.
Well, that's an interesting, I would say, scenario of this thing. And you brought out the Russia-Ukraine war, the reaction, the economic reaction to which seems like a self goal. Uh, if nothing else, I mean, it's quite funny that they're not seeing that what this whole, I think the 12th sanction package, or I don't know, 11th or 12th sanction package is done.
But there are enough carve-outs, Adi. There are enough
Oh
carve-outs.
yeah, that they will, that they will,
because they know the inflationary pressure that will result if they go full Monty on Russia.
Yeah, they can't. No, they have where do they buy the uranium from? So that's an issue. You said that they would need India to become the next China. My question to you would be: should we become the next China? Uh, China has its own disadvantages. Manufacturing does a certain damage to your environment and a whole lot of other things. Uh, China was based on a very easygoing labor law where they kind of didn't care about anything else, and this and that. Should we go that direction, or should we make our own way with regards to what a manufacturing country should look like?
Exactly. So this is a very pertinent question. And see, one thing is there. We are not going to be industrializing with the technologies of the 1990s anymore. Okay, that
Hmm.
is one thing. So the manufacturing technology, obviously they are resource intensive still, but the manufacturing technologies of today are much more efficient, right?
Yeah.
Even from a purely environmental standpoint as well. I'll give you one example. Our steel industry, right, is more carbon efficient than the steel industry of China by a fair margin. In
Is it?
fact, it is
Okay.
more, yeah. In fact, it is more efficient than most of the AE steel industries as well, which in any case is a sunset industry in the OECD, right? Almost a sunset industry. So we need manufacturing. Like I said, you would have noticed that despite not having the same level of manufacturing as, say, China or even Japan, we still have some of the most polluted cities in the world, right? Our rivers are also polluted. So there is a better way. There is a better way. We will not exactly replicate China's scale in everything. That is not going to be the point, because there will be other places to which they will friend shore and near shore as well, right? So there'll be Mexico in the mix. There is already Vietnam because of its proximity to China.
Yeah.
There will
Yeah.
be other places. But we will be the most significant. We will have to be, because only the Indian worker can replace the Chinese worker. But on the other hand, we will have to be careful in terms of, one, you said environmental degradation. Like I said, there are ways to address that now. The kind of industrial parks you can create now, the kind of, and also you need to look at land reuse, right? So it is possible, it has been found possible that an old internal combustion engine automobile factory can be used to become, can be turned into a factory for electric vehicles, because the overhead crane and the shed and stuff like that are basically reusable to an extent. Usually what happens is, suppose you had a light engineering enterprise somewhere in the proximity of a city. When that becomes unproductive, uncompetitive, you can't really turn it into another manufacturing
Yeah.
enterprise,
Yeah. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Usually real estate takes its place, and if it is
Hmm.
one of the older industries, then the land needs to be remediated hugely because it is polluted, it's toxic, right? So only real estate makes sense, especially during booms, taking into account the change of land use and the remediation and the detoxification that you have to do. But this is where we have to look at new approaches. We have to look at sustainable manufacturing, flexible manufacturing. Sustainable manufacturing is obviously easier said than done, okay? Because nothing is quite so sustainable as you said in the beginning. But this is where huge amounts of R&D need to go in, and we need to bring in the latest technologies as well. But we need to absorb them. We can't just be a recipient. One good thing that China did was, whenever they brought something in from the West, they also concurrently started a program of their own, and they had their own personnel in on hands-on mode. So the way we sign our contracts also needs to change. You get what I'm
Yeah.
saying? They would typically create a industrial R&D organization next to a big industrial cluster,
True.
which was a SEZ, where they were allowing all kinds of FDI to come in at very liberal, with very liberalized norms. So we need to learn from that. We need to focus hugely on sustainable manufacturing. There are many routes which are available today. Like I said, the technologies have changed, but that old problem will remain. That where you have agriculture, that is where you have manufacturing, and that is where you ultimately have high-end services. Where are these big IT campuses that we have made located? They are located on old agricultural land, because they needed land with groundwater to run all those cooling towers for the huge server banks and stuff that they have, right? So this problem is not so simple. When you talk about a riverine basin, invariably there is this degree of competition. So, but if you don't run that mixed economy, then the threat of financialization will always be there. See, the industrialists will at one point say, who is going to take the headache of building a plant over here? Right? Let me just use my profits to get into insurance. Let me use it to get into real estate. Let me use it for overseas investments. Right? That is
Service.
how the capitalist thinks, right? So financial capital. Unfortunately, late stage capitalism is not just consumer capitalism, it is also
True.
financial.
Yeah.
So that is where those are very real questions, and these are still being researched. These are essentially questions that I am interested in how do we sustain growth over time. But for the time being, see, we have to, in the long term, also have to look at the medium term. If we don't increase our manufacturing scale and scope, and understand one thing, why we need manufacturing, because manufacturing has become increasingly servicified. One manufacturing job ultimately sustains 7 service sector jobs. And it's not enough to, just be an exporter of services because of the protectionism that the West is doing. Because I told you, so they found that service sector jobs can also be outsourced, just like manufacturing can be offshore. So they have become increasingly protectionist, because if they lose all those service sector jobs as well, then aggregate demand will definitely fail, even more than it already has. So in a world where protectionism vis-a-vis services is rising, and the servicified component of manufacturing has increased so much, it stands to reason that we need to focus on manufacturing and manufacturing R&D, right? And also, and the reordering of the world economy gives us that opportunity: friend-shoring, near-shoring, and the fact that they need the Indian worker. But there are very real questions related to the environment that we will have to address, and the main question related to the energy, food, water nexus. See, what happens is, why is it that you have agriculture, manufacturing, and services co-located ultimately or at the same place? The reason for that is simple. The energy sector is highly dependent on the water sector, right?
Yeah.
Any thermal power plant basically draws a lot of water. And of course, it releases water back into the whatever it is drawing water from the sink. But that has its own environmental complications as well, right? When you look at food is highly dependent on the energy and water sectors. The water sector, if you take the water sector and not just groundwater, water sector itself is dependent on the energy sector, because you need energy for water distribution systems. And increasingly, like China, for instance, is looking at these grand north-south, east-west water transfer projects, etc. Because, the Yellow River doesn't reach the sea anymore, basically.
Yeah.
Yeah. The land and the Soviets, one of the reasons why the Soviets also collapsed was because they completely could not manage the EFW nexus. One glaring example would be the example of the Aral Sea, right? The Aral Sea was destroyed by the Soviets because they just diverted water from the Amudarya and Sirdarya for cotton cultivation in Uzbekistan, right? And basically in that whole South Central Asian region. And therefore the Aral Sea slowly dried out and we lost a whole major ecosystem. Now they are again trying to send water back into the Aral Sea. So, the Aral Sea has regained some of its water coverage. But what I'm trying to say is that will be a question we'll definitely face. But for the time being, we need to increase our manufacturing scale. And we need to attain scale in manufacturing, especially in the new industries. Some people say, they talk about this, you move from textiles to steel and then to this. That will not suffice. India, given its talent and the global knowledge, and which is reflected in the fact that, we have a tremendous amount of manufacturing R&D going on in our scale, but not for India, for global manufacturers. We have to merge our intellectual capabilities with the general workmanship and the industriousness of our people, of our masses. How did the British destroy India? They destroyed India because they did not allow the traditional workmen, which of course because of the caste system was somewhat hereditary, to basically flourish, to go to the next level. They had no access to capital, nothing, and they destroyed the old industries. So they also joined the ranks of landless poor. You would notice that India was the world's second largest economy in the 18th century, and then we had a secular decline and flatlined, and China also flatlined because the same thing was done to them through different methods. So that is what I'm saying. We need to focus on manufacturing. We need to focus on R&D, especially given the global geopolitical realignment going on and the servicification of manufacturing. If we want to really if we really want to capture value, which is very important, if we want our purchasing power to increase, to have more people employed, then we need to focus on manufacturing.
That's interesting. It's about basically a reset which is actually taking place, and that's what we see in front of us today. It's a interesting space where you find the West in a place where they're not able to kind of get their act right. It was always the place that the West was one step ahead, and today they are more reactionary to this whole game. How do you look at my last question to you in this wonderful discussion would be just a comment on, if India does become China, it's also as vulnerable as China. Having said that, internal consumption in India is much higher and stuff like that, so there's a little bit of a buffer right there. This whole decoupling which is happening and stuff like that. If you notice, what is the current game is one decoupling towards China and the Chinese talking about de-dollarization. So it's a financial war again, and India in its place has been able to kind of squirm through and get its currency going with about 18-20 countries. I believe that there is some talks of a IMF registration of the rupee and stuff like that. How do you see this entire game right now, where this financial war between the two giants, economic giants at least, if I may? I don't consider China to be that great a big giant in terms of its economy, but how do you see this going forward? Because you have decoupling on one side, you've got de-dollarization on the other side, and they both are out to harm each other, if nothing else. And there are bystanders that are going to get crushed. So how do you see this, along with the factor that if India does become the next China, we're as vulnerable to these kind of tactics in the future?
So, Adi, this is exactly the point. Okay, now it's like this. The West has the cards. America has the cards on the financial side.
Yep.
If you talked about de-dollarization, actually de-renminbization has happened in the last few years. Okay, in the sense, I'll give you examples. Let us take the IMF's allocated global reserves for all central banks put together, right? The renminbi is actually at only 2.66% of global reserves, RMB. And that is a decline from 2.88. This is the latest figure from 2 years ago. And the only reason they are at 2.6 is because of the geopolitical alignment between them and Russia, where the Russians have de-dollarized and have moved their central bank investments into renminbi securities, right? Renminbi denominated G6. So that is what they've done. Second, when you look at the renminbi's position as an international payments currency, it is well below 2% and has actually declined also vis-a-vis 2021. The only area where the renminbi has shown a big jump is in trade finance, from around 2% in 2021 to 4.5% now, right? That is the only place in the trade finance market, and that is entirely due to the Russia-Ukraine war and due to the problems that the West has created for dealing with Russia, right? And so the renminbi has been there. Now the problem is that what happens is You can never internationalize a currency unless you have a fully convertible capital account. Current account convertibility is not enough to internationalize a currency. Why
Hmm.
this whole BRI? Why did China come up with BRI? Why did China come has had the trajectory it has had since 2013 and all the various things it has done? It realized that America will do a Japan to it. Japan failed to internationalize the yen in the 1980s, and you can see where the Japanese yen has been for 35 years now. Okay, China thought that given its greater scale and its geopolitical position and its military
Yeah.
power, this was the time to go for it. So it came up with these structures where it would try to internationalize the yuan without opening its capital account, because it is still subject to what is called the financial channel of the exchange rate, to which India is also subject, right? Because what happens is, let me just take a minute. We talk about global spillovers. What happens? Why global spillovers? When you have an incumbent dominant currency in which people borrow, typically people in the EMEs, emerging market economies, many of them borrow with unhedged positions.
Yeah. Yeah.
They have unhedged positions, and they do not have enough counterparties from their own economies investing in that currency they have borrowed in for them to come up with instruments for hedging. See, if I am a borrower in the dollar, if there are people in my country who are investing in the dollar, then a market for hedging instruments onshore market for hedging instruments can emerge from a purely financial sector perspective. Because he faces one kind of currency risk, I face the exact other kind of currency risk. Okay. My currency risk is if the dollar appreciates vis-a-vis the rupee, whereas his currency risk is if the dollar declines vis-a-vis the rupee, right? So there is that. So you can form a hedging mechanism if you have a large enough market, but EMEs don't have that. Okay, so they typically have unhedged borrowing positions, private players, and their central banks, because of the huge borrowing in the dollar, hold huge amounts of reserves in the dollar to cover external debt and also to cover the import finance requirements. So that is how you've seen, and especially after the 1997 crisis that you had, the Asian financial crisis, all the central banks in the emerging economies, one of the ways in which they started hedging was starting holding huge amounts of precautionary dollar reserves, right? You will see there was a major increase in dollar reserves since then. And the other thing that they also did was they lent against their currency. Nobody agreed to full convertibility, right, of the currencies, and they all have partial floats, dirty floats. They do intervene from time to time to stabilize the exchange rate, especially vis-a-vis the dollar. The central banks have. Nobody has a free floating currency. I mean, most of the EMEs. So what has happened is they have hedged. You hold this. When suddenly there is a when if there is a sudden reversal, because what has happened is, because of the huge flow of dollars that happened after the global financial crisis, because they pumped in dollars into their financial system, and a lot of that leaked abroad because growth rates were better abroad and into EMEs. You created a situation where a lot of people borrowed in dollars but became subject to the interest rate movements in the United States. Naturally, the central bank. So the central
Yeah.
bank of the United States became the de facto central bank of the world, and the federal funds effective rate became the de facto benchmark rate for the rest of the world as well. So the moment you had this, you had any inkling that that the central bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, will start normalizing interest rates in the risk return space, it became more attractive to move money back over there. But a lot of people had already got unhedged positions by then, and that created massive instability, as you can imagine. And when money moves out like that, borrowed money, there is suddenly liquidity conditions dry up. And a very bad situation results in the emerging market economy, where the central bank of the market economy sees a very sharp trade off between growth and inflation. If they don't increase interest rates themselves, okay, then they will have a huge problem, because more money will flow out, the exchange rate will fall under great pressure, and pass through inflation will happen in the economy. At the same time, raising interest rates is not good for, obviously, for aggregate demand, right? So on the other hand, even that flow tightens liquidity conditions to such a rate that credit
growth in the economy also stutters. And you don't gain vis-a-vis exports because most of your exports are invoiced and denominated in dollars. So initially you cannot gain just in the initial period of currency decline, of exchange rate decline. So this is I'm putting the whole financial spillover aspect in a nutshell. So what do? You need to de-dollarize. You need to either encourage people to also invest in the dollar a lot, but that is contingent on the size of your economy, your financial sector. Or you need to start hedging with other currencies and looking at trade settlement and other things. And the third thing you can do is you can pool together your dollar resources, which is what the BRICS Bank did. Which is what BRICS was about. The CRA mechanism and all these hedge mechanisms that we've done, bilateral hedge mechanisms, is because of that. That is the other method to do it, where you pool together your dollar resources. Central banks pool together, and you have a contingency fund that the country most in need of can draw from to stabilize when dollars suddenly dry up because of a sudden reversal of capital flows. So that is how. So at that time, China was gung-ho on BRICS. It saw an opportunity to bring the global south together via the BRICS mechanism, but it also unleashed the BRI, and it also created AIIB, in which India is the second largest stakeholder, by the way. So it started creating an alternative financial architecture, but unfortunately, they continue to remain subject to the financial channel of the exchange rate, which I outlined just now. And that is why they had that huge problem in 2015 and 16 with capital outflows and massive yuan pressure. Right? So they are still subject to that. They have not been able to break out. And now they are in a dilemma. Unless they liberalize their capital account, they cannot internationalize the RMB. And unless they internationalize the RMB, they cannot really liberalize the capital account, because they will still be subject to the financial channel of the exchange rate with the dollar. Get the picture? On top of that, their entire economy is super leveraged. Right? It is hugely leveraged. Their leverage is actually higher than that of the United States. And they cannot really move interest rates much. So even as the world was increasing interest rates, China actually did basis point cuts in their benchmark rate, and also their RRR they increased. They released more money into the banking system. So what I'm trying to say is that India and China are both subject to the FCER. China cannot liberalize its capital account. If it cannot liberalize its capital account, it cannot internationalize its renminbi. Because when they go, these BRI countries also, that they would typically find that all their counterparties, even Laos and Pakistan, they wanted dollar loans. They did not want renminbi loans. What will you do with a renminbi loan? You can only buy stuff from China with that, right? But a dollar loan gives you much more flexibility. Now the other thing is, internationalization really would have happened if there were two BRI countries which are not China who were willing to settle payments in renminbi. Then internationalization would have happened. So China tried another path, that is the RCEP, which is further consolidation of the trade arrangements it already had in East Asia, in which it is at the core of that whole manufacturing model. So the thinking is simple. The more trade integration happens, the more likely it will become for private parties in any country, between the integrated countries, to deal in their bilateral currencies. The more they will deal in their bilateral currencies, the central banks of their countries will want to stabilize the exchange rate between these two countries. For that, they will start holding reserves or whatever the dominant currency is being used to trade in. And China thought it will be the yuan only. Say trade between China and Vietnam, the likely currency would be yuan. So the Vietnamese central bank, I'm giving a hypothetical example, would then start holding more yuan. The more yuan the central bank holds and intervenes to stabilize the yuan Vietnamese dollar exchange rate, the more Vietnamese counterparties will find it easier to borrow in the yuan. The more Vietnamese counterparties would borrow in the yuan, the more the central bank of Vietnam would want to hold yuan in its reserves. And then the dominant currency effect will take over. This is called the key currency area. Now, India happens to be part of America's key currency area. And you must have noticed the figures, right? India-America trade is now the largest bilateral relationship we have. Now, if that goes to 500 million, billion, we will very much stay part of the dollar zone. And we refuse to join RCEP, right? Because RCEP would have been a de facto free trade agreement between India and China.
India and China, and favorable to China itself.
We are very much part of the dollar zone. So this is the one. These are the mechanisms China has used, but it has failed. Unless you open your capital account, people say trade finance. Good. Okay, so we are trading in the renminbi now. For trade finance, we are using the renminbi because Russia has been sanctioned. We can't use dollars to trade with it. But the renminbi that we earn, or the renminbi that suppose Russia earns, what is it going to use it for? It will have to use it for some investment or for further payments. If there are others not willing to accept the renminbi, and if China doesn't have a doesn't have full capital account convertibility, why will the Russians also put buy RMB assets? Their money will remain stuck in China. They may not be able to bring it out. This is why, get the picture. So this is why just increase in trade finance does not mean that the renminbi is getting internationalized or the dollar is in jeopardy. So the dollar is incumbent, and the technological decoupling will ensure that China goes into follower mode like the Soviet Union before it. Okay, all the jumps that you've seen in China in technology will now, the pace of that may well decline because the Americans are really tightening the screws. How much China can invest and how much their global espionage networks can get for them, we'll have to see. It remains an open question. It's not so simple. It's just that so now it comes to the question. So if we now grow, have been coupled with the United States, we use the US market, we use the European market, we support the dollar by holding greater dollar reserves. When that day comes, when we are at 20 trillion, right, in say 2038 or so, or maybe earlier if the exchange rate improves, a nominal GDP, what will America do to us then? That comes back to the old question that you had right at the beginning, right? That will they do the same thing to us that they have done to Japan and they have done to China before us? My answer to that is absolutely yes. America will try to do the same thing to us that they've done to Japan and China before us. Exactly the same thing. So we have to be prepared for that day. We have to be very much, and for that requires a lot of brainstorming on our part on how to go about it. There's one difference though. We are deep inside, our people of our origin are deep inside the United States, much deeper inside than the Japanese people or the Chinese people ever were. And the United States will not be in the same position. Its incumbency has also been eroding over time. Its incumbent effect. The kind of United States Japan faced, China did not face. The kind of United States China is facing, we will not face. So let's see. It will be interesting. The mid 2035s will be the most interesting time in my view, when we will have to decouple from the dollar.
Oh, absolutely. This is going to be.
It's a story for another day.
Absolutely, that's a story for another day. We'll probably do another talk on that to analyze what would India need to do to strengthen up.
terrible day with the systems.
Oh, not a worry. Sometimes it is like that. That's all right. We were just wrapping up. So just let me just do that. Sir, this was an interesting conversation. As a matter of fact, we've brought out some very interesting factors with regards to what India's future is going to be. And as I was just saying that, how would India need to prepare for this whole, you know, I would say protecting itself going forward, uh, knowing very well the factor that it's the 5 trillion number. And if you look at the next two economies to us, except for China, Japan and Germany have not crossed the 5 trillion marker. That seems to be a bench line. So if you kind of cross that, it's more things are going to change for India and stuff like that. I'd like to request you. We could probably schedule another talk to understand that situation and what does India need to do. But for the moment, sir, thank you so much for bringing out some very important factors for us to know and track. And I'd like to keep this relationship going forward, sir, till the next time for another insightful episode. Jai Hind.
Thank you, Adi. Jai Hind.